Hello everyone, my name is Tom, and today we're talking about Eda from the Owl House, a rogue witch rebelling against the Coven system of the Boiling Isles and being a wanted criminal, while also being a very charming, foxy, and likable character, on top of being a degenerate who is not at all morally pure. That's right, I'm doing another video about the duality of characters who don't fit black and white labels of good and bad, but ultimately, I feel when you break it down, Eda is an overall good character who happens to have very clear but reasonable flaws, hence why she is never positioned as a villain in the story of the Owl House and why a lot of people like her. There have been a lot of explorations on why we tend to identify with characters like this and easily forgive their shortcomings, characters typically labeled as anti-heroes. So I'm just going to give the gist of the theory behind it as background so we're all on the same page, but there's plenty of material out there about anti-heroes where you can get a more in-depth understanding, so I'm not going to go too deep here, because we're not here for the trope, we're here for the character. The idea is basically that by creating a character who leans towards not being a great person and acting on less than righteous feelings or desires, who also has a heart of gold which manages to shine through, creates this situation where that character is within reach to connect with, since they're starting from a place that resonates with most, and since it resonates, you start to see a bit of yourself in the character, so you want to root for them and the possibility of making better choices and having a more positive impact on the world around them. Eda, I feel, falls into this category because she is a vigilante witch, not falling into a lawful alignment. She is habitually selfish, and she clearly has her vices, but she does hold morals and values that most people can get behind or at least understand. Speaking for myself, I know that I have my less than perfect tendencies and habits that have made me come across as a difficult person to the people around me, and in the past even led me to some antisocial behavior, but at the end of the day I have a pretty strong stance on what I think is right and wrong that ultimately dictates my actions and the means I might take to get to an end, which has led me towards gradually becoming a better person. But I tend to notice we all have some level of this internal struggle going on between hedonistic individualism and an empathetic desire to improve the conditions of the world and the lives of those around us, which is a struggle Eda faces openly, creating a perfect canvas for growth. So let's get into who Eda is. Eda is the Owl Lady. She is the mentor and temporary guardian to the main character Luz. She runs a flea market stand. She is probably the most powerful witch on the Boiling Isles, partly because of her refusal to align with a coven, which would have limited her power. She has a strained relationship with her sister, who is a cop, as we have discussed. Her sister also, spoiler alert, cursed her into being the Owl Lady because she felt that she would threaten her chances of getting into the Emperor's Coven, so now Eda lives in her owl house with her pet/roommate, King, and is trying to make Luz into a witch. So I mentioned Eda being selfish earlier. What do I mean by that? Well, she tends to act in her own self-interest, and even as she has taken Luz under her wing, she tends to prioritize her own goals, habits, and convenience over what is expected she provides for Luz, which in this scenario would be passing down fundamental knowledge on being a witch as well as just being responsible for her well-being in an adult-child dynamic. And Eda doesn't always deliver on these things. For example, instead of training Luz, she tends to send Luz on errands or have her help with her business. This could be some Karate Kid method stuff, but it doesn't seem like that. Partly because when Eda is doing some weird method of training, she still frames it as training, like when she was trying to get Luz to be one with nature, to learn a new spell like she was teaching her senjutsu. We could infer that this was actually going to help Luz in the end goal of learning a new spell, even if it seemed unorthodox. But sometimes she's just like, yo, return my library books for me. Thanks. And we know that this structure affected Luz's progression because there were several times when Eda had to be like, oh yeah, I ain't taught you this, huh? To the point where even getting into Hexside, she had to cram last minute to learn that new spell because she wasn't skilled enough yet to meet the prerequisite requirements. So what this tells us, as the audience, is that Eda is probably not always the best person. She has a habit of focusing on herself and neglects her responsibilities towards others until they become immediate issues. A key symptom of laziness and a flaw that puts her and others in stressful situations that could have easily been avoided. She likes to cut corners. She is unmotivated. She has an air of self-importance and can be an all-around antagonistic person. And we see through her past that she has always been fairly antagonistic, as well as just all-around rebellious through degenerate behavior, even if that degenerate behavior was pretty cool. But more importantly to take away from Eda's past is her priorities. When she was set to face off against her sister for a spot in the Emperor's Coven, she forfeited fit to give Lilith the opportunity, and you could say this was purely because she just had no interest in joining a coven. However, I prefer to give her the benefit of believing she just wanted what was best for her sister and was putting her sister's future above her own. Because I'd also argue that as egotistical as Eda can be, she probably had some desire to just show how good she was and prove that she could get into the Emperor's Coven if she wanted to. But she set that aside because she didn't want to risk humiliating Lilith or damaging her credibility. Then this backfired because Lilith cursed her to sabotage her chance at winning that spot, and if Eda knew back then that was Lilith, the person she was putting before herself, maybe it would have changed her selflessness. Maybe it would have caused trauma around the idea of putting other people first like that. But wait, did we not just say that Eda is selfish now in the present? Would it not make total sense that this rebellious young wild child was very empathetic and would put others first until she got burned for it? Would it not make sense that knowing Lilith stabbed her in the back would have created trauma around being selfless, and that's why she is how she is now? That would make sense, but that's not what happened. All that did was reinforce Eda's anti-establishmentary attitude, because now she was really not going to join a coven after being publicly humiliated and alienated. So she would double down to cope with the trauma around that and embrace her role on the outskirts of society as a low-profile reject, embracing that as part of her identity, making her more self-reliant. This would make being selfish a necessary trait for survival despite her selfless nature. Yet, despite her priorities in many cases, and her tendency to exploit others for her own gain, when she cares about people, she tends to go against her own character for the good of others. In the first episode, Eda takes Luz on a dangerous adventure to reclaim King's crown, which is literally just a paper crown like the ones you can get at Burger King. But she went through this great endeavor, even getting her head cut off, just because she knew it would make King happy. And the next thing you know, she is risking her own life and knowingly running straight into a trap because Luz is in danger, and saving her is more important than her own safety. Even more admirable is the fact that after burning her bridge with the Witch World and Hexside Academy, she did whatever it took to get Luz into Hexside Academy, which was huge. Why? Because she was the one responsible for teaching Luz magic. That was her role. It was a feat of a witch that she had not accomplished as far as we know, and the success of her student in some ways says something about her abilities as a witch, especially when Lilith has Amity under her wing, and Amity is the top of her class. So the fact that Eda put aside her pride, looked at Hexside, and admitted to herself that it would be better if Luz could learn primarily through the academy instead of solely through her, admitting that that would be better for her in her journey towards becoming a witch, in a way would be conceding to her sister and everyone she stood against that the traditional methods actually do have merit, but she also had to humiliate herself in order to make amends with those in charge at the academy for them to allow Luz to attend in the first place, which tells us that, even though she has shown that she is very self-absorbed, lazy, unmotivated, prideful, and stubborn when it comes to her values, she is actually very driven to do right by the people she cares about and is willing to go the extra mile for them. And Luz is what brought this out of Eda to inspire her to change. Because Luz was the thing that she cared about most, that demanded the most change that she was willing to put forward. Yes, she cared about King, but King has a very low need threshold. Luz is putting her future in Eda's hands, a future which Eda is invested in partly for her own gain, but also for Luz. Over time, Eda cares more and more for Luz. At first, it's just because she can see a bit of herself in Luz, but as she realizes that Luz isn't the same as her, she comes to appreciate the differences between them and appreciates Luz indiscriminately for who she is, while also becoming more and more invested in her and her future. Which is why we see her actions change to be more selfless more often and also grow as a person in general. But how does she grow as a person? Well, she certainly has a bit of resentment against her sister, not because she knows that she's the one who cursed her, but because, as we've said before, Lilith is a cop and Eda hates cops. So in Eda's mind, that bridge has been burned. They are on opposite sides of things, and Eda doesn't actually hate Lilith, but there is some very clear tension and animosity between the two over the fact that they've been pit against each other. It's igniting the fact that the two operate on two different schools of thought, and the clash of those two things has created a rift in their relationship. Eda is someone who marches to the beat of her own drum, while Lilith does things by the book. But because Lilith's way is the way of the status quo, it's much easier for her to extend the olive branch of please just be normal, while Eda feels more and more resentment towards her sister's position. So this is a case where Eda may have wanted to make amends with her sister, but doing so would go against her nature, and she just wasn't ready to make that sacrifice for her sister the way that she had for Luz or King. But Luz was building her up to do that. Sure, circumstance played a role. The fact that these things were out in the open, that Eda now knows Lilith cursed her, and that's now been mutually acknowledged and processed. The fact that the Emperor ain't a great guy and Lilith could no longer side with him over her sister. The fact that she helped Luz save Eda from the Emperor, and that she took on part of the burden of the Owl Curse, that all played like a minor role. Actually, it's pretty much entirely those circumstances that led to their reconciliation. I don't want to downplay that in order for this relationship to be repaired, Lilith had to take responsibility and do her part to meet Eda where she was at, after participating in a literal witch hunt against her. However, I still stand by the belief that it was Eda's personality traits, which could be perceived as negative, that were ultimately maintaining the wall between her and her sister. Traits perceived as negative, but clearly served a purpose, as we can see. Lilith may have wanted to legitimately make amends with her sister, but that would have been at the cost of Eda and her freedom, either through being turned to stone by the Emperor or by being confined to the Emperor's coven. Eda would be a prisoner either way. So the bullheaded and stubborn distance which Eda put between herself and her sister was the price of living a free life, which she found fulfilling, which is selfish, yes, but being selfish isn't always a bad thing, especially for someone like Eda, who actually tends to put other people first more often than not, even when she has learned that it might not be in her self-interest. So Eda lived her life in a way that demanded very little responsibility from her, so she could finally put herself first with very little consequence. It wasn't until Luz came into her life where she had to be responsible, or else it would create consequences for someone who was dependent on her. Therefore, she had to change her ways because it was no longer sustainable to act as distant and selfish as she once did. And even if it was circumstances that brought Lilith back into Eda's life, it was Luz that prepared Eda both mentally and emotionally to be ready to accept Lilith's apology and accept her back into her life now that the time and situation is right. In conclusion, Eda is a very likable character because she reflects a lot about who we might be or who we wish we could be. She has the ability to stand up for herself. She is unapologetic and honest about her flaws, but at the end of the day, she knows right from wrong and will go above and beyond to avoid letting her loved ones down. But of course, I want to hear what you think, so let me know in the comments down below, or find me at TommyPQM on Twitter, Instagram, and Twitch, or find the Roundtable at Roundtable Vids on Instagram and Twitter. If you enjoyed this video, be sure to give it a like, share it with your friends, and if you haven't already, subscribe and hit the bell to never miss a video, and shout out to all our patrons on Patreon for supporting the channel. My name is Tom, thank you so much for watching, I hope you have an awesome day, and I'll see you next time. See ya!